back to Sharing the Brain. This is episode 8. I am Steve Magadance and joined once again by my good colleague. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hello, everybody. This is Stu Guthrie. And of course, Lolly today is very interested in being a part of the podcast. So there she is. So she's with us. And episode 8, we're kind of kicking around some ideas on what we might want to talk about today. And Steve, you brought up the idea of Thanksgiving. Obviously, we're just a week or so away, and so it seemed very appropriate. What did you have in mind when you brought that up, Steve?
Well, I've been thinking about a lot of things lately, just about this idea of being grateful. I know this is, the annual time where we think about the things that we're thankful and grateful for, but it made sense to just talk a little bit about maybe this podcast and how we're grateful for the professional conversations that have been created as a result of it. Although we don't have, hundreds of thousands of followers, I think that I'm really grateful for the way that people are interacting with the conversations that we're having. Of course, we've had several guests on and we've continued to follow them and follow their work. And we've also had people use the podcast and reference some of the things that they're hearing and some of the things that we're discussing with some of our guests in their own work. And I think that's really, one, it's gratifying, and two, it speaks to this idea of having a larger conversation about our work. And it helps us, I think, dig up some of the underlying assumptions and some of the things that are important about what we do with kids every day. I don't know. What do you think about that, Stu? What are you grateful for?
No, I think that's well said. And I am thankful for this podcast. We're going to do a little segment or a little section after this is over and talk about how the whole idea of sharing the brain came about. And we have talked about it a couple times before, but it's 7 years in the making. And I think it kind of started out as a joke maybe, but now that we've actually gotten to do it, it's rare, honestly, when I don't go to a meeting or something and somebody comes up and says, "Hey, I watched your podcast," or "Hey, that's a great idea," or "Can I be on?" Like you said, we've had a number of guests. And while we're talking about our guests, I did want to let everybody know that last episode rather, when we had Rebecca Cummings on about the SCL, we apologize. Her volume was really low. It was kind of hard for us to kind of raise her level without us kind of blaring our own side. But we are going to get her back on. She has a lot to say. She's a great person, and she's so likable. I know that when our first guest, Jennifer Lomas, was on, Steve, we talked about hiring and finding that right person for your team. And I don't remember if we said it or not, but talking about how likable people are, how the likability factor. And even though it's not real quantifiable, and it's a tough way to go about hiring people, obviously, but it is a factor. And Rebecca has that all over, and she's just a great person to talk to. So we're going to get her back on. But yeah, I've been very thankful for our guests and the interactions that we've had with people on Twitter, and it's just been a lot of fun. So that's my initial take on what I'm grateful for regarding this podcast.
Yeah, I think another thing that I would jump in and say about that, I think you're right, like having a group of other individuals around who, have a common idea about what the mission is of the institution that you're working in. And I feel like I've got a pretty good group of staff members who work with me on a regular basis. And I think both in the way that they support the things that we're doing and also push me to think about being better at what I'm doing. I spent a week in Boston last week and working with professionals, both from my current school and professionals that I've reconnected with, nationally a little bit. And I continue to be surprised by the things that I think I'm doing well and the things that I didn't think about that I could actually be doing better. So in a sense, this podcast has helped uncover some of those things too, although we espouse like our own beliefs and our ideas about teaching and learning. I mean, it's never a bad thing to have someone push that. And I feel like I've been pushed over the last couple of weeks, and I continue to think about the ways that I've been pushed and some of the assumptions I make about the way school could operate or is operating. And I continue, although I don't always say it, I continue to be thankful and grateful for that, because that's what helps me to develop as a leader. And I think for my part, for you, like the way that you also push, we may have said on this podcast that you and I, although we do share a brain, we maybe are not always on the same wavelength or aligned in the same areas of thought, and the ability to keep pushing each other to think or reframe our questions, reframe our ideas over the last almost 10 years, Stu, if you can think about that. It's been a good number of years that you and I have known each other. So I really appreciate that.
No, and I say the same thing. And I think what, in the little 15 or 17 minutes that we kind of do the little podcast, you don't really get a sense of it. But Steve and I do not agree on a lot of things. But
Well,
it's always been a very,
we agree that I'm right most of the time. Isn't that what we agree on?
yes, absolutely not.
Absolutely.
Absolutely not. Absolutely. Yeah. But we don't, and obviously this is an education podcast. And so we're primarily talking about those things. And we do agree educationally probably more often than we don't. But that's what makes our conversations, are rich. And I'm not really sure I want to do a politics podcast because that may not be as much fun, but educationally we do agree a lot. And I do want to hear more about your trip to Boston. We had talked, and we tried to do a podcast, maybe kind of a remote from you in Boston. But one quick thing before you start talking, share that with us.
Yeah.
About our circles. And we always kind of discuss our podcast. Sometimes it's 14 seconds, sometimes it's 2 minutes. And I shared a little bit with Steve about how I enjoy, and I'm thankful for the contacts we have. And I kind of had this visual, like we're all walking Venn diagrams. And when you walk into somebody, you kind of, your circles kind of overlap, and you get to kind of see where the commonalities are, and you get to talk about those things. And the podcast has been great for that. And I know in our everyday work at school, you're covering lunches, you're answering phone calls, you have meetings, you're off campus. There's so many ways you don't get a chance to let your Venn diagram sort of cross over. And so that has been another thing to be very thankful for with this podcast, and just opening up conversations. And typically it does happen more when you get to go to a training, or you're off campus or doing something where you're working with other professionals. So I know you went to Boston. Tell us more about that, because I am curious to hear kind of your takeaway now that it's been a week since you've been back in town.
Yeah, no, shameless plug for that. There's an organization that I've been affiliated with since its inception called the School Reform Initiative. And it primarily began, or at least in my own context and experience, as a teacher-driven professional development structure that uses a set or different types of protocols to help structure conversations, really about educational, professional dilemmas, sometimes looking at student work, student products, or a lot of times looking at that, and increasingly thinking about this idea of equity in education. And so the conference that I participated in last week in Boston collected educators from really globally. There were people from Hong Kong, people from the local area. There was, a delegation from Texas, folks from other states across the country, and talking about how we provide education for all. And I think that, sometimes we make a lot of assumptions that what we're doing is actually serving all of the kids in our room, or even all the staff in our building. And I think that's where I was pushed, thinking about the voices that are involved in planning and mission and visioning for a school and for a staff, and making sure to include the voices that aren't always present. And I think the same goes obviously for the classroom. Like, how are you thinking about the students who aren't always speaking up, aren't always asking questions, aren't always, giving a sense of what they understand, what they don't understand, what they're confused by. And so that pushed a lot of my assumptions. I will just say it. I mean, you and I are both similarly looking individuals, right? We're both white males, right? And so
Right.
I think we
And we're also
our haircut,
gifted.
yes, has
Yeah.
grown into a different phase. But
Yeah.
I think we make a lot of assumptions about how
Sure.
the world works through our own eyes. And those assumptions are not always valid, but they tend to be dominant assumptions across, different social structures. And so that idea
Absolutely.
of how we appropriately plan for, appropriately make space for, and deconstruct some of those held norms that we have in some of these social systems is really what that conference was about, like in a really big sense.
Right.
So I brought some work and some ideas that I've got about the vision and the progress toward vision, and how well we align at the own campus that I work on, and got some really good feedback that pushed me in ways that I hadn't expected. So I really appreciate that collegial kind of conversation. And I've totally been dominating the mic. What questions do you have about that, Stu?
No, I think that's a great point. And you're right. It's not just the kids, it's the staff. And
Yeah.
I recognize that not every staff member, even though we At my school, we talk about teacher leaders. How can we get more teachers involved? Where can they, find a way to involve themselves? And not everybody's comfortable doing it. And some people
Yeah.
just don't feel like they have the skills to do it. And I think, you're always talking about being intentional and being purposeful. And I love to find those opportunities when you have something that just it's begging for somebody to step in, but you know who that person might be, or you have a suspicion. You talk to them and you kind of walk them through what it may look like the way I see it, but give them the latitude to, hey, go out and give it a shot, see what happens. There's a quote that I use all the time. It's about taking calculated risks. And the quote is just that: take calculated risk. It's quite different from being rash. And I would love to know who said that so I could attribute it to them. But I tell people that all the time: go take that risk. Just take it. Just see what happens.
Mhm.
And with just that little bit of empowerment, they kind of take it. And sometimes it's been it opens more doors for them to be a leader in different regards. And so I know that you also we talked on the phone while you were there
Mhm.
about going to a school where they had
Oh
some
yeah.
real honest conversations with teachers. And I thought that was very interesting because my background initially was psychology, psychiatry, counseling,
Yeah.
and I had some thoughts about that. Do you want to share kind of how that school operated or that technique operated?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember that conversation, but earlier in the week, last week before the conference started, I got to go visit Francis Parker Charter School in Devens, Massachusetts, and they were one of the original essential schools started by Dr. Theodore Sizer. And Dr. Sizer, unfortunately, is no longer with us, but he was able to come and visit the campus where I currently work. About 20 years ago, actually, and he developed this whole set of principles that what are the essential pieces of the school. So this school is sort of living that mission, and we were there to look at teacher residency program and think about how we we looked at a protocol called excavating teacher protocol. And I'd love to talk more. We could probably spend a whole episode on that, but
Right.
it was having a conversation about transferability, looking at, say, like a teaching resident, or maybe an intern, or a student teacher, right? We hear those words to describe the same kind of situation, a mentor teacher, and then like a teacher coach, right? Someone who might be responsible for coaching the student teacher, or the resident or intern, and then working on that triad of how that intern or how that student teacher is understanding, learning about, excavating the moves that the mentor teacher is making in the classroom, to think about how they are transferable across their own practice, right? So that was the idea of the protocol as I understood it. And it was really, really interesting work. And as I think about how it could be used even on any campus, really, like how can we have conversations between professionals about, when you do that, what is it that you're thinking about, or why do you make that move? Why do you ask that particular question? And then help teachers figure out how to transfer those kinds of moves, those kinds of questioning techniques, those kinds of really basic pedagogical things into a different setting or into a different context, right? Because we hear a lot like, well, what works for one student or what works for one teacher might not work for another teacher. But in
Sure.
reality, pedagogy has some similarities, right? I mean, there are moves that we make with professional development teaching with teachers. There are common moves that teachers make across classrooms, and it doesn't matter what the content is. And I think that is the idea of this protocol and of that visit, to understand how we coach pre-service teachers into developing some of those strategies, some of that pedagogy, and transferring some of those practices to an effective classroom.
And that's exactly the conversation that we had. And sometimes it's a good thing when you hear something and you just kind of you take your first blush. The first thing that kind of came to me. It's also dangerous sometimes because you're just hitting the surface. You're not really getting the depth of what the whole concept is. But when you mentioned that to me, the first thing that came to mind was, what about the I don't say safety, that sounds a little too dramatic, but in having those conversations, talking about somebody's teaching practice is very personal. And
Yeah.
how do you get them to share in a way that does the things you're talking about, gets them to translate practices to others, take an honest look at how they teach, but at the same time, get them to feel comfortable and sharing? Because it sounds to me like the principal is going to be involved, and the principal is also the evaluator, and
Yeah.
the evaluations are very big.
Yeah.
Even if we tell them, hey, we're here to help you out, this is a conversation, all those things that we say to make them feel better.
Yeah.
And the thing that came to mind at the time I couldn't recall the actual name, but it's unconditional positive regard. It's a Carl Rogers technique, or it's a staple of his psychotherapy, where the therapist is there with the person, and
Mhm.
you're not making any judgments. You're just being there for the person to let them kind of, talk about what's on their mind. And that immediately came to mind for me. How do we, what is our role to just make them feel comfortable so that that whole conversation can start? Because you know what I'm getting at. If that conversation is stilted, or it's scripted, or it's practiced, you're not going to get anything out of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because we part of that visit process, and I feel like I'm hedging up some conversation that I had with a colleague that I traveled with, who I hope will be a guest on this podcast.
Oh, I know exactly who you're
You know
talking about.
exactly, yeah.
We'll talk about that too. I'd
Yeah,
love to have, yeah.
um, we mo- not we tried to role play the process, if that makes sense, and we had to be very transparent with ourselves that all three of us in that particular triad, were coming in with an agenda, right? I mean, a teacher coach comes in with an agenda, the mentor teacher comes in with an agenda, the resident comes in with an agenda. And how do you develop the rapport, the relationship, to understand that we're all doing this work together, right? There is this solidarity piece that is in service of students, right? Of all students. And at the same time, we had to be really cognizant about the agendas that we brought, or the ulterior motives that maybe we brought into the conversation. If we saw something without having full context of it in a classroom that we had observed for 10 or 15 minutes. So you're right. I think that's a huge, huge thing. And I think that pulling the evaluative part out of that, right? It's not about evaluation, whether it's good or bad. It's about understanding why and what
Right.
next, and what was the thought process in those teacher moves. But that's tough. I mean, I think that
Yeah.
you're right. I mean, in this role, in our hierarchy, we're evaluators, right? We're the ones that things get asked of. We're the ones who are responsible for, like, the operation of the campus through the views of anyone above us, right? And even of our community. Like, we're the ones that people want to talk to as the principal or as the primary learner, right? So that's a
Right.
tough thing to extract.
No, I think it's a good point, and I'd like to hear more about it. So, talk to us about our potential guests, because I have not had a chance to meet the doctor. But tell us about.
Well,
Go
I
ahead.
don't know if that's true, because I think you met the doctor a couple of times when she brought students to our previous campus where we
Yes, you're
were
right. I
together. But
do. I did get to meet her. That's true.
yeah, it's Dr. Angela Bridenstine. She's a professor at Trinity University, and she works in the Department of Education there. She was actually one of my teachers um, of maybe a few years ago. And I'm hoping that she'll be on the podcast. We couldn't quite get the schedule to work. And when she visited Boston with me. And when between airports and conversations and meetings and practice, it was just tough to kind of get the schedule to work together. So we're hoping to have her on soon to talk maybe a little bit about excavating teacher practice, maybe even talk about teacher residency, how we're
Okay.
developing a next generation of teachers who will be in our classrooms. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about educational equity. She has a lot to say about that too. So we'll
Okay.
see if we can get that scheduled.
That'd be great. And if anybody would like to also talk about building teacher capacity, I think those are two topics that kind of came up today, along with what Steve is saying. Would love to have teachers, anybody who feels like that's something that's near and dear to them, or something that they've seen in practice, or they've seen people grow. Because we also have had that, where we've had worked with a teacher, hired a teacher, and I always tell people, you never know when you're going to be working for them, because some people just have that knack, and they have that desire, to move up into leadership positions. And I think, like Steve said, we've been around for a while. You eventually work for one of your teachers that you had, kind of way back when.
Yeah.
So I think that'd be a great topic if anybody's interested in sharing the brain in that regard. So let's get back on topic just a little bit about what we're thankful for. So let's kind of go back and forth, and just a couple quick things that maybe at your current school or just in general. And then we have some feedback on Twitter that would like to share as well. So Steve, what do you got? Give us something that you're just thankful for, kind of off the cuff.
Well, we're about to send 375 kids all across this country starting tonight, which is Saturday. And I'm super thankful for the professional colleagues that work with me on a daily basis, and the care that they're going to take in protecting our students' learning during these week-long trips. So we'll be gone. I'll be taking a bit of a trip with my own group of students. I'm going to travel with ninth graders this year, and I'm super thankful for that team that's taking kids and preparing the trip for them.
Very good. And where are y'all headed to?
I'm headed to Perryville, Arkansas to visit Heifer Ranch.
All right. That sounds like an exciting place to go visit.
It's going to be great.
I've never been to Perryville, Arkansas. I've never been to Arkansas. Then I think we drove through one time. I'm sure all of our viewers in Arkansas are going to be thrilled to hear that.
Maybe we'll get some viewers in Arkansas as a result of that plug.
Maybe so. Maybe we should get some Sharing the Brain podcast cards, and as you go through, just drop them in the windshield, on the windshield wipers of all the teachers there, and maybe we'll have some Arkansas viewers.
That would be really cool.
Well, I'll tell you what I'm thankful for. Something came to me this morning. I had to run up to the school, and actually, I don't run anywhere, but I saw on both sides of the road going back and forth, joggers, lots of joggers out today. It's a beautiful day, and lots of deer out running on the roads today. So it was a beautiful morning. It was very cold. It was freezing when I left the house here, but it was a beautiful day, and pulled up to the school. And that feeling when you go into your school when nobody else is there and it's quiet. And I think I may have shared this before when I first got my principalship at the current school. Mm-hmm. You walk in the hallways and you kind of just take a look around, and things obviously are a lot different. It's quiet, and you get a chance to kind of really take a look and look at things. Sometimes you notice things like I noticed there were some ceiling tiles, little tiny ceiling tiles that were just out of place, and we'll get that fixed. But you get to look at the work on the walls. And the one thing that caught my attention today, something I'm very thankful for, of course, was the work itself. But a student had went out and put all this work of their peers up, and they were perfectly aligned. And that may sound like kind of a not an important thing, but whoever did that, whichever student did that, took a lot of pride in not just their work, but the work of the other students to line them all up perfectly down the hallway. And that just caught my attention today. And, it talks, I know I'm using your word when I say collegiality, but in their own kind of way, they were taking care of their peers as well and putting that work out there. So to have students at the school I work with that feel that way about their work and the work of the others meant a lot to me today. So I was thankful for that.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
It's a good thing. And I did not go jogging. I'm the guy that if you ever see me jogging, people would stop to see what was chasing me. Yeah. To see if there was some, danger nearby, or maybe, to get their phone out and make sure they recorded it so they could get the clicks. Yeah. On YouTube when whatever it was that was causing me to run caught me. So yeah, that's about it.
I'll tell you the last thing that I think I'm grateful for, and that is the 54 followers that are currently following the Sharing the Brain Twitter account at Sharing the Brain. And you threw out a tweet where you tagged the Twitter account today about telling us what you're thankful for. So we'd love to hear from our 54 or so, maybe more followers, about the things that you're grateful for in your professional practice. I think we'd like to share those maybe if we can on another episode. Yep. So tweet us or tweet either of us directly, and we'd love to share the things that you are grateful for. And I think we're really happy for you listening.
Yeah, and I have one last thing. This is, I know, been a topic of the conversation about my Heisman B trophy. Actually, I have to be honest, it's not a Heisman B. It's the Adam Hernandez Trophy. And Adam is now an administrator, and he's a super guy, and he also was the first winner of our fantasy football league. And so he made the trophy, and so naturally, if you make the trophy, you get to put your name on it. So that's from Adam Hernandez. It had a prominent place right there. And now I know one of our followers is a big Van Halen fan, so I put that there for them. And I would love to have that Twitter follower who's currently anonymous to come join us, come be on the podcast, and we'll talk about all kinds. We'll talk about Van Halen. Why not? It's probably better than talking about politics. So, but I also appreciate everybody that listens, and especially when y'all come up and share with us something that you've heard on the podcast or just anything at all. It does mean a lot to us. We obviously enjoy doing it, and we hope it's meaningful to one of the 54 people out there. So, Steve, wrap it up, and we'll call it a morning for this podcast.
Yeah, no, I think that was the perfect way to wrap it up. And you said the perfect thing that I would say. When you see us, if you're interested, if you want to say something, please don't hesitate to let us know. We're happy to have the feedback in person and on Twitter.
That's right. And the last thing I will share, I know we keep saying it's the last thing, is come here, Lolly. I'm actually going to give Lolly away to one lucky viewer. So no, I'm not giving it. Y'all have a great day. We'll see y'all.
All right. Bye.
I don't want to.
Here it is.